The prison transport ship, called the Void Fang, cut through the darkness of deep space like a blade through black water. And inside its rusted belly, 46 prisoners sat chained to the walls in silence. Ethan Mercer was one of them. He sat in the far corner, with his wrists locked in heavy magnetic cuffs, his head slightly bowed, his eyes half closed, and his breathing slow and steady, like a man resting after a long day of work, rather than a man being carried toward the most feared prison station in the galaxy. Around him, aliens of every shape and size filled the transport hold. Tall ones with armored skin, short ones with 6 limbs that trembled without stopping, wide ones with bioluminescent veins pulsing in panic beneath translucent flesh, and winged ones whose feathers had gone stiff with fear. None of them looked at ease, and most of them had not stopped shaking since the ship had left port. A large creature with tusks the color of iron leaned toward the alien beside him and whispered in a low rumble, "Where are they taking us?" The answer came from a thin, insect-like being across the aisle, who clicked its mandibles before speaking in broken common tongue. The cradle of silence, the station inside a dying star, the place where the Veltari break those they wish to erase from memory. The words moved through the hold like a disease, and the fear that had already filled the air grew thicker and heavier until it was almost hard to breathe. Only Ethan did not react. A small 6-limbed creature the size of a child sat on the bench beside him, its tiny clawed hands gripping its own knees, its 4 dark eyes blinking rapidly in terror. This was Rin, a Korvathi mechanic who had been arrested for stealing fuel cells to feed his family back on a colony world that the Veltari had stripped of resources. Rin glanced at Ethan and noticed something strange. The human was calm, completely and absolutely calm, as if this moment meant nothing to him at all. "You are human, yes?" Rin whispered, his voice thin and shaky. Ethan opened one eye and looked at the small creature beside him. "Yes. I have heard of your kind," Rin continued nervously. "They say your species is soft. No armor, no venom, no claws, no regeneration. They say your bones break easily, and your skin tears like paper." Ethan said nothing to this. He simply closed his eye again and leaned his head back against the cold metal wall. Rin swallowed hard and added, "I am sorry for you." The ship shuddered as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the viewport at the far end of the hold filled with an image that made every prisoner gasp in horror. A massive star, swollen and red, bleeding light and radiation into the void, and there at its edge, orbiting just inside the outermost layer of the corona, was a station made of black metal and white fire. Silence. It looked like a crown of thorns floating in a sea of burning gold, and the heat from the star was so intense that even through the ship's shielding, the air inside the hold grew warm and dry. The transport docked with a deep metallic groan, and the doors opened to reveal a long corridor lit by pale blue light, lined on both sides by Velthari soldiers in sleek dark armor, carrying weapons that hummed with a low and dangerous sound. The prisoners were unchained from the walls and marched in a single file down the corridor, their feet dragging, their bodies trembling, their hope draining away with every step. At the end of the corridor stood a wide-open chamber with a raised platform at its center, and on that platform stood a figure that made even the largest prisoners shrink back in fear. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with skin the color of deep violet, eyes like twin stars burning silver white, and a face that was beautiful in the way a blade is. Beautiful, sharp and dangerous and without mercy. Her name was High Inquisitor Selvania Drekath, and she was the ruler of this place, the voice of the Velthari Senate's will, and the last face that thousands of prisoners had ever seen. She wore robes of liquid black that moved like living shadow around her body, and her long fingers were adorned with rings that pulsed with faint light, each one a different tool of measurement, scanning, and judgment. She descended from the platform slowly, her silver eyes sweeping over the line of prisoners, like a predator choosing its prey. One by one she stopped before each prisoner, scanned them with her rings, and spoke a single word or phrase that sealed their fate. Tier 3, moderate resilience, possible survival through 4 chambers. Tier 2, high pain threshold, will likely fail at chamber 5. Tier 4, impressive biology, worthy of study before death. Each number was a death sentence, measured in degrees, and every prisoner who received their tier classification felt their spirit crack just a little more. Then she reached Ethan. She stopped, and for a moment she simply looked at him, at his medium build, his scarred hands, his unremarkable height, his dull brown hair, his steady breathing. Her rings pulsed as they scanned him, and the data that flowed across her fingertips made her lips curl into a slow, cold smile. "A human," she said, and her voice carried through the chamber like the ring of a silver bell struck against stone. She circled him slowly, her eyes tracing every detail of his body with the precision of a scientist examining a specimen. Soft skin, easily punctured, easily burned, easily torn, she began, and her voice was calm and almost musical in its cruelty. Thin bones that fracture under moderate pressure, no natural venom, no armor plating, no regenerative capability of note, no tolerance for vacuum, no psionic defenses whatsoever. She leaned in close, so close that Ethan could feel the cold that radiated from her skin, and she whispered with a smile that held no warmth at all. "You will not survive the first trial. Your kind never does." Ethan looked at her, not with anger, not with fear, not with defiance, but with something she could not read. Something quiet and still and impossibly deep, like the surface of an ocean that hides a world of darkness beneath. He said nothing. This pause, this silence, this refusal to react, it unsettled her for just a fraction of a second, a flicker so brief that no one else noticed it, but it was there, and it was real. She straightened, turned away, and spoke his classification to the recording system without looking back. Tier 0, no measurable survival potential, estimated duration less than 90 seconds. Tier 0, the lowest classification ever given in the history of the Cradle of Silence, a rating that meant the system considered him already dead. The other prisoners looked at Ethan with something close to pity, and even the ones who had received terrible ratings of their own felt a brief moment of gratitude that at least they were not him. Only Rin looked at Ethan with something different, not pity, but confusion, because the human still had that same quiet calm on his face, as if the words of the most powerful woman in the station had meant absolutely nothing to him. The prisoners were led to their cells, dark metal rooms barely large enough to stand in, stacked in rows deep inside the station's core, where the hum of the dying star vibrated through every wall and floor. Rin's cell was next to Ethan's, separated by a thin wall with ventilation gaps near the ceiling, through which they could hear each other. "Human," Rin whispered through the gap, "are you awake?" "Yes. I want you to know what is coming. The trials are 7 chambers, each one designed to test a different limit of biology, and each one is worse than the last. Heat, pressure, poison, vacuum, radiation, psionic attack, and then the last one which they call the silence. No one has ever survived all 7, and most do not survive the first 3. A long pause followed, and then Ethan's voice came through the gap, calm and even and strangely warm. "Thank you, Rin." That was all he said. Rin pressed his face against the ventilation gap and peered through into Ethan's cell, and what he saw made his 4 eyes widen with disbelief. The human was lying on his back on the cold metal floor, his hands folded over his chest, his eyes closed, and his breathing slow and deep. He was asleep, not pretending to sleep, not lying still while his mind raced with terror. He was truly, deeply, peacefully asleep, as though he were lying in a warm bed on a safe world, far from this burning hell. Around them, in every cell, on every level, prisoners wept and prayed and screamed and begged in languages from 100 worlds. The sound of 45 living beings facing the certainty of death. And in the middle of all that noise, all that fear, all that despair, one human slept like a child who had been promised that tomorrow would be a good day. Rin pulled back from the gap and sat in the darkness of his own cell, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something strange and unfamiliar stir in his chest, something small and fragile and completely unreasonable. The morning came not with sunlight, but with a sound, a deep, resonating horn that echoed through every corridor and cell of the Cradle of Silence, shaking the walls and pulling every prisoner from whatever broken sleep they had managed to find. Ethan opened his eyes, sat up slowly, and stretched his arms above his head as though waking for a routine day. The cell doors slid open simultaneously, and armed Velthari guards marched through the corridors, shouting commands in sharp voices and pushing prisoners into formation with the butts of their weapons. Ethan walked out calmly, and the first thing he noticed was the heat. The station's inner temperature had risen overnight as the orbital path brought them closer to the star's corona, and the metal floors were warm enough to feel through the thin prison boots. The prisoners were herded into a vast staging area at the mouth of the trial chambers, a long hall with 7 massive doors on one side, marked with a symbol in the Velthari script, and above each door, a glowing number displayed the death count. How many prisoners had died inside that chamber since the station's construction? The numbers were enormous. Warden Goal stood at the center of the staging area like a mountain of living armor. 8 feet tall, 350 pounds of Drukhon muscle and bone plating, with small eyes that glowed a dull orange, and a jaw wide enough to crush a human skull between its teeth. He carried no weapon because he did not need one. His fists were weapons, his body was a weapon, and his complete lack of mercy was the most dangerous weapon of all. He looked at the line of prisoners the way a butcher looks at livestock. And when his eyes fell on Ethan, the only human, the smallest and softest-looking creature in the group, he let out a low grunt that might have been laughter. "Tier 0, Goal rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. "Never seen a Tier 0 before. I wonder if you will last long enough for me to blink." Ethan looked up at the massive warden and gave a small, quiet nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement, the way a man might nod at a stranger on the street. This confused Goal, and confusion made Goal angry, so he turned away with a snarl and began calling the first group of prisoners forward. The first trial was heat. The door to Chamber 1 opened, and a wave of air rolled out that was so hot it made the nearest prisoners stagger backward. The temperature inside was designed to simulate the surface of a volcanic world, over 1,200 degrees, hot enough to melt certain metals, hot enough to turn organic tissue to ash in seconds. The first group of 10 prisoners was shoved inside, and the door sealed behind them. Everyone in the staging area could watch what happened next on the massive screens mounted above the chamber doors, and what they saw was terrible. 3 prisoners with no heat resistance collapsed instantly, their bodies smoking and curling as the heat devoured them in seconds. 4 more with moderate resistance lasted between 1 and 2 minutes before their biology gave out. 2 with natural heat armor managed nearly 4 minutes before cracking and falling. And only 1, a massive rock-skinned Gethrani, survived the full trial duration of 5 minutes, stumbling out when the doors reopened with his stone flesh glowing red but intact. Then the second group was called, and more died. And then the third group, and more died still. And then it was Ethan's turn. He was placed in a group with 9 others, and as they were marched toward the open door of Chamber 1, every eye in the staging area turned to watch, not because they expected anything remarkable, but because they wanted to see how quickly the Tier 0 human would fall. Ethan walked toward the chamber door, and as the heat hit him, his skin immediately turned red, and sweat erupted from every pore on his body in a sudden violent flood that soaked his prison clothes within seconds. The Veltari observers in the monitoring booth above noted this reaction with visible disgust. One of them recorded in her log that the human's body was leaking fluid in a catastrophic failure response, unaware that what she was witnessing was one of the most sophisticated cooling systems in the known galaxy. Human sweat, the thing that aliens mocked as disgusting and primitive, was the reason Ethan's skin temperature dropped just enough to keep his cells alive as he stepped fully into the chamber. The heat was unimaginable. It pressed against him from every direction, like a living thing trying to crush him. It filled his lungs with fire. It made his vision blur and his muscles scream. And every nerve in his body sent the same desperate signal to his brain. Run, flee, escape, you are dying. Deep inside his cells, in the hidden architecture of his DNA, where Project Colossus had done its quiet and terrible work, something activated. Not like a machine turning on, but like a sleeping animal opening its eyes. His thermoregulation systems pushed beyond normal human limits. His cellular walls hardened against thermal damage. His blood flow redirected to protect vital organs, and his pain receptors were dampened, not silenced, but turned down just enough for him to think clearly through the agony. He walked forward, slowly, steadily, one foot in front of the other, deeper into the chamber where the heat was worst. Around him, other prisoners were falling, screaming, burning, dying, but Ethan kept walking, his jaw clenched, his fists tight, his eyes fixed on the far wall. The observers in the monitoring booth stopped talking. Selvania, watching from her private command deck high above the staging area, leaned forward in her chair. 3 minutes passed, then 4, then the full 5-minute trial duration ended and the chamber doors opened. Ethan walked out. His skin was raw and blistered, his hair was singed, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and steam rose from his body like smoke from a dying fire. But he was on his feet, and he was breathing, and he was alive. The staging area went silent. No one spoke, not the guards, not the prisoners, not even Warden Goal, because what they had just witnessed was supposed to be impossible, and yet it had happened right in front of their eyes. Ethan leaned against the wall outside the chamber, closed his eyes, and took long, slow breaths while his body began the work of repairing itself. Work that would have taken a normal human weeks, but that his Colossus-enhanced biology would accomplish in hours. On the screen above, his survival was recorded. Trial 1, survived. Beneath that, his tier classification still read, Tier 0. The second trial came 4 hours later. The pressure chamber. This one simulated the crushing gravity found at the bottom of the deepest oceans on the heaviest worlds. A force so extreme that it compressed bones, collapsed lungs, and ruptured organs in most species within the first minute. Prisoners with exoskeletons, beings whose entire biology was built around structural strength, entered the chamber with confidence and came out broken, their shells cracked like eggshells, their bodies bent at angles that no living thing should bend. Ethan entered with his group, and the moment the pressure hit him, his knees buckled and he fell to the floor, with a sound like meat slapping against stone. The weight was beyond description. It felt as though the entire station had been placed on his back, and every bone in his body groaned under the strain, and the blood vessels in his eyes burst and turned his vision red. But inside him, the Colossus. Augmentations responded again. His skeleton, reinforced at the molecular level, with carbon lattice structures woven into the bone matrix, redistributed the stress across his entire frame. And his muscles, enhanced with synthetic fiber bundles that contracted harder under pressure rather than weaker, pushed back against the crushing force. He crawled, hands and knees scraping against the floor, blood dripping from his nose and eyes, every movement a war against gravity itself. And then slowly, impossibly, he rose to his knees, and then to his feet. He stood in the center of that chamber, shaking, bleeding, barely upright, but standing, for the full duration of the trial. When the doors opened, he walked out on his own legs, and behind him, 3 aliens with natural exoskeletons lay dead on the chamber floor. Beings that evolution had specifically designed for pressure, broken and gone, while a soft-skinned human from a medium-gravity world had survived. Staging area was no longer silent. Now it hummed with whispers, with disbelief, with the beginning of something that sounded almost like awe. Trial 3 came 2 hours after that, the neurotoxin fog. A gas designed to be lethal to 98% of known species was pumped into a sealed chamber at concentrations that could kill a Drukan in 4 minutes. And Drukans were considered one of the hardiest species in the galaxy. Ethan breathed it in, and his body reacted violently. He vomited, he shook, he bled from his nose and mouth. His muscles seized, and for 30 terrible seconds it looked like the toxin had won. But then his liver, enhanced by Colossus to filter compounds at a rate 60 times faster than a normal human's, went to work, breaking down the molecular structure of the toxin and converting it into waste that his kidneys flushed from his bloodstream in minutes. He was the only one in his group who walked out of that chamber, breathing. The other prisoners stared at him as he passed, not with pity anymore, not with the look they give to the weak and the doomed, but with something new, something bright and dangerous that spread from face to face like a spark catching dry wood. Hope, the most dangerous thing a prisoner can feel, and it was all because of one quiet, bleeding, stubborn human who refused to fall. In the observation cells above, where prisoners not yet called for trials could watch the feeds, Ryan pressed all 6 of his hands against the screen and watched Ethan sit down against the wall of the staging area, with his eyes closed, and his chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. "What are you?" Ryan whispered, and his voice cracked with emotion he could not name. On the command deck, Sylvania pulled up Ethan's file for the 3rd time. Human, male, age 34, born on Earth, no genetic modifications on record, no cybernetic implants detected, species, classification, baseline sapient, unremarkable, and for the 3rd time the data told her nothing that explained what she was seeing. She closed the file and sat in silence for a long time, watching the live feed of Ethan's cell, where his wounds were visibly closing, his blistered skin smoothing, his broken blood vessels repairing themselves in real time. That evening, she went to see him. She walked into the prisoner block alone, without guards, without weapons, and she stood outside his cell and looked at him through the energy barrier with those burning silver eyes. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, and when he looked up at her, there was no hatred in his face, no anger, no fear, just that same impossible calm that she could not understand and could not break. "What are you?" she asked, and for the first time, her voice held no mockery, no superiority, only a question, raw and real. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and then he answered, in a voice that was quiet and simple, and carried the weight of a truth she was not ready to hear. "Just a human." She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the secret, for the hidden truth that would explain everything. But all she found was a man with tired eyes and healing scars who meant exactly what he said. She turned and walked away without another word, and her footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something she could not yet see. Back in his cell, Ethan closed his eyes and slept again, deep and dreamless and unafraid, while the station hummed around him and the dying star burned outside, and somewhere in the levels above, a woman who had never been wrong about anything in her life lay awake in the darkness and wondered, for the first time, if she had made a terrible mistake. The news spread through the cradle of silence, the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, hot, and impossible to stop. A human had survived 3 trials, not just survived, but walked out on his own 2 feet, and his tier classification was 0, the lowest ever recorded, a rating that said he should have been dead before the first chamber door even closed. Prisoners whispered his name in the corridors during transfers. Guards muttered about him in the break rooms. And the monitoring staff replayed his trial footage over and over, with expressions that shifted slowly from amusement to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. But the person who felt the weight of this news most heavily was High Inquisitor Selvania Dracath, because the Cradle of Silence was not just a prison. It was a monument, a symbol, a declaration carved in black metal and fire that said the Veltari were superior to every other species in the galaxy. Humans surviving its trials threatened to crack that declaration wide open. She sat in her command chamber on the morning of the 4th trial and read the messages from the Velthari Senate, urgent, angry, demanding, and each one carried the same desperate question: how is this possible? She did not have an answer, and that was what frightened her most. The 4th trial was vacuum exposure, hard vacuum, no suit, no protection, nothing between the prisoner and the cold, empty void of space, but their own biology. Most species died within 10 to 15 seconds. Their blood boiled, their lungs burst, their eyes ruptured, and their bodies swelled as every gas inside them tried to escape at once. The galactic record for unassisted vacuum survival was 45 seconds, held by a Drukan warrior named Ket Val, who had become a legend among his people for that single, terrible achievement. Ethan was marched to the vacuum chamber, wearing nothing but his thin prison clothes, and the guards who escorted him walked a little more slowly than usual, as if some part of them wanted to delay what was about to happen. The chamber was a transparent dome on the outer hull of the station, and through its walls the dying star blazed in all its terrible glory, filling the dome with red and gold light that made everything inside look like it was already on fire. Ethan stepped in, and the door sealed behind him with a hiss that sounded like a final breath. Then the air was pumped out. It happened fast. In less than 3 seconds, the chamber went from standard atmosphere to absolute vacuum, and the effect on Ethan's body was immediate and violent. His skin swelled as the pressure dropped. His saliva boiled on his tongue. The air in his lungs rushed out in a silent scream that no one could hear, and his blood, trapped inside veins that were suddenly the only thing keeping it from boiling, pounded against the walls of his cell. Circulatory system like a trapped animal trying to escape. Any normal human would have lost consciousness in 15 seconds and died in 30. But Ethan was not a normal human, not anymore. Not since the scientists of Project Colossus had spent 3 years mapping every weakness in the human body, and finding ways to turn each one into something that could be survived. His skin pores sealed shut, a Colossus modification that made his outer layer function almost like a natural pressure suit, keeping enough internal pressure to prevent his blood from boiling outright. His metabolism slowed, dropping in seconds to a state that was closer to hibernation than wakefulness, reducing his oxygen needs to almost nothing. And his blood, enhanced with synthetic oxygen-carrying molecules that stored reserves far beyond what normal hemoglobin could hold, continued to feed his brain and heart, even as every other system in his body shut down to conserve what little life remained. He floated in the vacuum, his body swollen and discolored, his eyes bloodshot, his mouth open in a silent expression of agony that was somehow also perfectly controlled. And the seconds ticked by on the monitoring screens. 10 seconds, the observers leaned forward. 20 seconds, whispers began. 30 seconds, the whisper stopped. 45 seconds, the Drukan record fell, and a murmur of shock rippled through every monitoring station on the ship. 1 minute, Warden Gull, watching from the staging area, took a step backward without realizing it. 2 minutes, Salvania gripped the arms of her command chair so hard that her rings cracked against the metal. 3 minutes, the monitoring staff began checking their instruments, convinced something must be malfunctioning. 4 minutes and 37 seconds, that was when the automated system finally pulled Ethan back in and flooded the chamber with atmosphere. He gasped. A terrible, ragged, desperate sound that echoed through the monitoring feeds. And then he breathed, and breathed again, and his sealed skin pores opened, and his metabolism surged back to full activity, and his body began the brutal work of repairing the damage that 4.5 minutes of space had done to him. He was alive. 4 minutes and 37 seconds in hard vacuum with no suit, no technology, no protection, just the body he was born with, and the modifications that had been made to push that body to its absolute edge. The Drukan record of 45 seconds had not just been broken, it had been destroyed, shattered, made to look like nothing at all, and the being who had done it was not some heavily armored warrior from a high-gravity death world, but a soft-skinned, thin-boned, supposedly fragile human from a little blue planet that most of the galaxy had never bothered to visit. The 5th trial came 12 hours later, and it was radiation bombardment. The chamber flooded with enough concentrated radiation to sterilize a warship. Gamma rays, neutron particles, and wavelengths that had no name in human language, all focused on the occupant at levels that could strip the DNA from living cells in seconds. Ethan walked in, and the radiation hit him like an invisible wall of destruction. His cells died. Millions of them, billions of them, whole sections of tissue collapsing as their genetic code was torn apart by the bombardment. And for the first 30 seconds, his body was losing the war badly. But then the Colossus failsafe triggered, the deepest and most radical modification that the project had ever achieved. Hyper-regeneration. Human DNA already had the ability to repair itself. Every person alive carried this capability, a legacy of billions of years of evolution, on a world where the sun itself was a source of constant radiation damage. But Colossus had built something beyond it, taken this natural ability and amplified it beyond anything the scientists themselves had thought possible. Ethan's cells did not just repair. They rebuilt, faster than the radiation could destroy them, creating new tissue to replace what was lost, adapting the replacement cells to be slightly more resistant than the ones that had died, learning from the damage and becoming stronger because of it. He emerged from the chamber burned, blistered, half-blind, with skin that looked like it had been held over an open flame. But he was healing, visibly and rapidly, new pink skin forming over the burns, even as he walked, his vision clearing with each step, his body turning the worst assault the station could offer into nothing more than another wound to recover from. In the prisoner observation block, Rin watched the screen with all 4 eyes wide open and tears running down his small gray face, because what he was witnessing was not just survival. It was something that felt almost holy, something that made him believe that the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than the Valthari had ever allowed anyone to think. That evening, between the trials, Rin was given maintenance duty in the corridor outside Ethan's cell, a small mercy from a guard who had begun to look at the human with something other than contempt. And through the ventilation gap, he spoke to Ethan. "How?" Rin whispered, and that single word carried all the confusion and wonder and desperate need for understanding that had been building inside him since the first trial. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was tired but warm, like a man telling a story by firelight. "Where I come from," he said, "there is a world called Earth. It is not a special world, not by galactic standards. The gravity is moderate, the atmosphere is thin, the climate is unstable, and the dominant species, my species, has no armor, no venom, no claws, no wings, no regeneration that anyone would notice. He paused and took a slow breath. But we crossed oceans in ships made of wood, Rin, dead trees held together with rope and tar. And we sailed into storms that could swallow cities because we wanted to know what was on the other side. We climbed to the top of our tallest mountains, where the air was so thin that our lungs bled. And we did it because the mountains were there and we wanted to stand on top of them. We walked on our own moon, Rin, using rockets that were barely more than controlled explosions strapped to tin cans. And we did it because we looked up at the sky and decided that the sky was not the limit. We survived ice ages with nothing but fire and animal skins. We survived plagues that killed millions by learning to fight diseases we could not even see. And we survived each other, which, trust me, was the hardest thing of all. We were never the strongest, or the fastest, or the toughest species on our own planet. We shared our world with creatures that could crush us, poison us, eat us alive, and we survived them all, not because we were better built, but because we never learned when to quit. His voice dropped lower, and something in it changed, something heavier, something that carried the weight of a secret. Project Colossus did not make me into something new. It did not add alien DNA or cybernetic implants or anything that was not already human. All it did was find the limits of what a human body could do and push those limits as far as they could go. Everything I am in these trials, the heat resistance, the pressure tolerance, the toxin filtering, the vacuum survival, the regeneration, all of it was already inside every human who has ever lived, just locked away, just waiting to be unlocked. The galaxy looks at us and sees weakness, Ethan said quietly. But what they are really seeing is potential, has not yet been fully released, and that is a very different thing. Rin sat in silence for a long time after that, turning the words over in his mind. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Are there others like you? Like me specifically, enhanced by Colossus? I am the last one, Ethan admitted, and there was a sadness in his voice that Rin could feel through the wall. But like me in the ways that matter, stubborn, adaptable, too stupid to know when to die. There are 8 billion of them on Earth, and every single one of them carries the same potential I do. In her command chamber high above, Sylvania sat alone in the dark and watched the live feed of Ethan's cell, where his burns were nearly healed and his blind eye was regaining its sight. And she thought about what she had read in the reports, that this species, this supposedly insignificant species, had gone from stone tools to nuclear weapons in the blink of a cosmic eye, had gone from horses to spacecraft in less than a century, had mapped their own genome and begun rewriting it within a single generation. She had built her career, her reputation, her entire worldview on the absolute certainty that the Veltari were the pinnacle of biological achievement in the galaxy, that no species could match them, challenge them, or threaten them, and now a single human was making that certainty crumble like old stone. She opened a secure channel to the Veltari Senate and spoke in a voice that was steady despite the storm inside her. I recommend immediate termination of the human subject. Outside of trial protocols, lethal force, no further testing. The Senate's response came within minutes, delivered by a senior counselor whose voice was calm and dismissive. If he dies in the trials, he is a footnote in a report that no one will read. If we execute him outside of protocol, he becomes a story, and stories are far more dangerous than any one man. Let the chambers do their work, Inquisitor. That is what they are built for. The channel closed, and Sylvania sat alone with the silence and the hum of the dying star. And she stared at the screen where Ethan Mercer, Tier 0, the man who should not be alive, was doing push-ups in his cell, steady and rhythmic and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. She whispered into the empty room, and her voice was stripped of all its authority and power, cruelty, leaving behind only the raw and honest sound of a woman confronting something she did not understand. "What are you?" And for the first time in her long and decorated career, there was no contempt in that question, only dread, deep and growing, like the shadow of something vast, rising from beneath still water. The sixth trial was different from everything that had come before, and every prisoner in the Cradle of Silence knew it. The first 5 trials attacked the body: heat to burn it, pressure to crush it, toxin to poison it, vacuum to burst it, radiation to destroy it. But the sixth trial attacked something deeper, something that could not be armored or reinforced or enhanced by any known technology. The sixth trial attacked the mind. They called it the psionic shatter. The chamber was lined with emitters that generated concentrated psychic frequencies, waves of energy that bypassed every physical defense and struck directly at the neural architecture of the brain, overloading synapses, scrambling thought patterns, and tearing apart the very fabric of consciousness like a hurricane tearing apart a house made of paper. Most species went catatonic within seconds, their minds simply shut down, retreating into a darkness from which they never returned. Those who lasted longer often suffered fates worse than death, their brains so badly damaged that what came out of the chamber was alive, but no longer a person in any meaningful sense. The longest anyone had ever endured the psionic shatter was 41 seconds. A Veltari monk who had spent her entire life training her mind for exactly this kind of assault. And even she had emerged with permanent damage that left her unable to speak or recognize her own reflection. Ethan was marched to the chamber door, and for the first time since his arrival at the station, the other prisoners did not look at him with curiosity or awe. They looked at him with grief, because they believed this was where his journey would end. The mind was the one thing that could not be made tougher, could not be pushed past its limits, could not be forced to endure through sheer human stubbornness, or so everyone believed. Rin stood in the observation area, pressed against the barrier, his 6 hands clasped together, his 4 eyes wide and wet, and he watched Ethan walk toward the chamber with that same steady, unhurried stride that had carried him through every trial before this one. The door opened. Ethan stepped inside, and the door sealed shut. The emitters activated. The effect was instantaneous and terrible. Ethan's body went rigid, every muscle locking at once, as the psionic frequencies slammed into his brain like a freight train hitting a wall. And he screamed, not a controlled sound, not a sound of defiance, but a raw, animal scream of pure agony that echoed through the monitoring feeds and made even the Veltari guards flinch. He fell to his knees, blood pouring from his nose, his ears, the corners of his eyes, his mouth, blood everywhere, pooling on the floor beneath him as his brain hemorrhaged under the assault. On the monitoring screens, his neural readings went haywire, synaptic activity spiking to levels that should have meant instant brain death, then crashing, then spiking again in wild and chaotic patterns that the Veltari scientists had never seen before. Selvania watched from her command deck, and for a brief moment she felt something that might have been relief. Finally, at last, the human had met something he could not endure, something that would end this impossible story and restore the natural order of things. 10 seconds passed, and Ethan was still on his knees, still screaming, still bleeding. 20 seconds, and the screaming stopped, not because the pain had ended, but because his throat had given out, leaving only a silent, open-mouthed expression of suffering that was somehow worse than any sound. 30 seconds, and the neural monitors showed something that made every scientist in the monitoring booth lean forward with disbelief. His brain was not dying, it was changing. The human brain, under extreme psychic trauma, does not simply endure the way a bone endures pressure or skin endures heat. It does something far more extraordinary, something that no other known species neurology can replicate. It reroutes. When one neural pathway is destroyed, the human brain builds a new one, in real time, under fire, while still taking damage. It creates detours around the destruction, finds new connections, forges new links between regions that were never meant to communicate directly. And it does all of this, not as a conscious decision, but as an automatic survival response hardwired into the deepest and oldest parts of human neurology. Project Colossus had found this capability and amplified it 100-fold. Ethan's brain was being torn apart by the psionic emitters, and it was rebuilding itself faster than they could destroy it. Not just rebuilding, but adapting, learning the pattern of the attack, and constructing defenses against it, turning the very damage it was receiving into a blueprint for how to survive. More. At 41 seconds, he matched the all-time record. At 50 seconds, he surpassed it. At 1 minute, something changed in his body. A shift, a gathering, a focusing of every ounce of will and consciousness he had left into a single, burning, unbreakable thought that blazed through his restructured neural network like a signal fire on a dark mountain. Stand up. His hands pressed against the blood-slicked floor. Stand up. His knees straightened, shaking, trembling, barely holding. Stand up. And he stood, blood still running from his face, his body swaying, his eyes unfocused, but open. He stood in the center of that chamber while the psionic emitters screamed at maximum output and threw everything they had at a mind that refused, absolutely and completely refused, to break. The emitters surged, and then with a sound like breaking glass amplified 1,000 times, they overloaded. Lights in the chamber flickered and died. The psionic frequency cut out instantly, and in the sudden silence that followed, the only sound was Ethan's ragged breathing. In and out, the sound of a man who had been to the edge of oblivion and come back. He had not just survived the psionic shatter, he had broken the machine. The station alarms triggered immediately, emergency lockdown protocols activated, security doors slammed shut throughout the facility, and red warning lights bathed every corridor in a pulsing crimson glow. But the alarms were not fast enough to contain what happened next. The prisoners, all of them, every survivor from every trial, every soul still breathing in the cradle of silence, erupted. They had watched a human walk through fire and pressure and poison and vacuum and radiation, and now they had watched him break an unbreakable machine with nothing but the power of his own mind and the fear that had kept them. Obedience shattered just as completely as the psionic emitters had. They rioted, smashing barriers, overwhelming guards, flooding into corridors in a wave of desperate, furious, hope-fueled chaos that turned the orderly prison into a battleground in seconds. Rin, small and quick and clever, darted through the chaos to reach Ethan, finding him slumped against the wall outside the shattered chamber. Conscious, but barely so, his face a mask of blood and determination. "Can you walk?" Rin asked, grabbing Ethan's arm with 2 of his 6 hands. "I can walk," Ethan answered, and his voice was hoarse and broken, but steady. They moved through the corridors together, the small alien mechanic and the bleeding human, while around them the station descended into chaos. But the chaos did not last long, because Salvania had one final weapon, and she did not hesitate to use him. Warden Goal. The massive Drukhon moved through the corridors like a natural disaster, crushing rioters with his bare hands, throwing prisoners into walls hard enough to shatter bone, clearing entire sections of the station single-handedly with a brutality that was almost mechanical in its efficiency. And he was hunting for Ethan, not because Salvania had ordered it, though she had, but because the Drukhan's record had been broken. His species' pride had been wounded, and Goal was the kind of creature who understood only one response to wounded pride: violence. He found Ethan in a junction corridor on level 7, a narrow passage between two security checkpoints, and when the 8-foot wall of armor and muscle stepped into the corridor and blocked the way forward, Rin made a sound that was halfway between a whimper and a prayer. Goal looked at Ethan, at the blood, the wounds, the swaying stance of a man who had already given more than any being should be able to give. And he smiled, showing rows of teeth like industrial rivets. "Should have died in the first chamber, human," Goal said. "I will correct that mistake now." Ethan looked up at the warden, and despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the blood still drying on his face, there was something in his eyes that made Goal's smile falter for just a moment. It was not fear, and it was not bravery. It was recognition. The look of a man who had seen this fight coming from the beginning, and had already planned how it would end. Goal charged, 350 pounds of Drukhon fury covering the distance between them in 2 massive strides, and Ethan moved. He did not fight like a Drukhon. He could not match Goal's strength or armor or reach, so he fought like a human, which meant he fought dirty, adaptively, and without a single wasted movement. He dodged the first strike by dropping low, letting Goal's fist slam into the wall behind him with enough force to dent the metal, and in the same motion he drove his elbow into the nerve cluster behind Goal's left knee, a spot he had identified by watching the guards walk for days, noting where the armor plating was thinnest and the movement was most vulnerable. Goal stumbled but did not fall. He was too strong, too resilient, too angry, and he swung again, catching Ethan across the ribs with a backhand that sent the human flying into the opposite wall with a crack that could only be bones breaking. Ethan hit the wall and fell to the floor, and for one terrible second it looked like it was over. But then he moved, rolling sideways as Goal's foot came down where his head had been, and he scrambled upright, using the wall for support, his left arm hanging at an angle that said it was broken in at least 2 places. The fight continued, brutal, savage, ugly, with Goal landing blow after blow that would have killed any other prisoner instantly, and Ethan taking each one, absorbing the damage, letting his Colossus-enhanced body keep him alive, just long enough to keep fighting. He used the environment, kicking loose panels into Goal's path, pulling cables from the walls to tangle the warden's legs, luring him into tight spaces where his massive size became a disadvantage. And every second that passed was a second Ethan spent studying, learning, adapting. Then he saw it, the gap. Every Drukhon had it, a thin line at the back of the neck where the bone armor plates met, a seam no wider than a finger, protected in normal circumstances by the sheer difficulty of reaching it. But Goal had turned his head just slightly too far while trying to grab Ethan from behind a support column, and that seam was exposed. Ethan grabbed a shard of metal from a broken wall panel, sharp, thin, strong enough, and he launched himself at Goal with everything he had left. Goal caught him, one massive hand closing around Ethan's throat, lifting him off the ground like a doll, but Ethan's right arm was still free, and with the last of his strength, the last reserves of a body that had been pushed beyond every limit that nature and science had ever set, he drove the metal shard into the gap in Goal's neck armor. The shard went in deep. Goal's eyes went wide, his grip loosened, and he staggered backward, reaching for the metal buried in his neck. But his hands were too large, and the shard was too deep, and the blood was already flowing fast, dark and thick. The warden fell, slowly, like a great tree cut at the base, and when he hit the floor, the sound echoed through the corridor like a drum marking the end of an era. Ethan collapsed beside him, gasping, broken, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his left arm shattered, his ribs cracked, his body running on nothing but the fumes of a will that refused to be extinguished. Rin rushed to him, and behind Rin came other prisoners who had witnessed the fight. Dozens of them, filling the corridor, staring at the fallen warden and the human who had killed him. No one spoke. Then Ethan, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood and goals, looked up at Rin and at the faces of the prisoners gathered around him, and he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried the absolute, unshakable weight of a promise. There is one trial left. After that, we leave. Not a question, not a hope, not a plea. A statement, simple and final, spoken by a man who had walked through hell 6 times and intended to walk through it once more. And every prisoner who heard it believed him. The 7th and final trial was called the Silence, and it was the one that every prisoner feared most, not because it was the most painful, not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most complete. There was no heat in the silence, no pressure, no toxin, no vacuum, no radiation, no psionic assault. There was nothing at all. The chamber was a sphere of perfect emptiness. No light, no sound, no gravity, no temperature, no texture, no sensation of any kind. And the subject floated inside it in absolute and total sensory deprivation, cut off from every input that the brain used to understand itself and the world around it. This was not a trial of the body, or even of the mind in the way the psionic shatter had been. This was a trial of the self, of identity, of the fundamental question that every conscious being must answer. Who am I, when there is nothing left to tell me? Most species collapsed within minutes, their consciousness, deprived of all external reference points, simply dissolved like salt in water, unable to maintain coherence without the constant stream of sensory information that normally held it together. The longest anyone had ever survived the silence was 11 minutes. A Korvathi philosopher who had spent decades in meditation training, and she had emerged alive but fundamentally changed, unable to fully reconnect with reality for the rest of her life. Ethan stood before the chamber door in the early hours of what might have been morning. Time had lost all meaning in the station since the riots, and his body was a map of everything he had survived. Burns fading to scars, bruises yellowing across his ribs, his left arm splinted with strips of metal and cloth that Rin had fashioned from salvaged materials, his face still carrying the marks of the psionic shatter's assault. The surviving prisoners had gathered in the staging area, filling every available space, standing in the corridors and on the catwalks above. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species, all watching the human, who had become something none of them had words for. Rin stood at the front of the crowd, his small body trembling, his 4 eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "You do not have to do this," Rin said, quietly. Ethan looked at him and smiled, a real smile, tired and cracked and warm, and he said, "Yes, I do." He turned to the chamber door, took a breath, and stepped inside. The door sealed, and the world disappeared. There was no gradual transition, no slow dimming of light or fading of sound. One moment he was standing in a room, and the next he was floating in nothing, absolute and infinite nothing, a void so complete that the concept of direction ceased to exist. He could not see, there was nothing to see. He could not hear, there was nothing to hear. He could not feel, there was nothing to feel, not even his own heartbeat, because the chamber's technology suppressed even the internal sensations that normally anchored consciousness to the body. He was alone with his mind and nothing else. The first minute was the hardest. Without sensory input, the brain panics, it screams for information, for stimulus, for anything to confirm that it still exists, that the world still exists, that the boundary between self and void has not been erased, and when no information comes, the panic grows, feeding on itself, spiraling toward the dissolution of coherent thought. Ethan felt it, the pulling, the unraveling, the terrible sensation of his own identity beginning to thin and stretch, like fabric being torn apart by invisible hands. And for a moment, just a moment, He understood why this trial was the one that broke everyone. But then he did something that the designers of the silence had never anticipated, something that no species they had ever tested had been capable of. He remembered, not vaguely, not as a desperate reaching for fading images, but clearly, vividly, with a richness and depth that turned the inside of his mind into a world as real and solid and alive as any planet he had ever stood on. He remembered Earth. He remembered sunlight, not the concept of sunlight, but the feeling of it, warm and golden on his face on a summer afternoon when he was 8 years old, lying in the grass behind his parents' house with his eyes closed and the smell of cut lawn filling his nose. He remembered rain, the sound of it on a tin roof during a thunderstorm, the way it made everything smell clean and new, the feeling of cold drops hitting his skin as he ran from the car to the front door laughing because his mother was laughing. He remembered music, a song his father used to play on an old guitar in the evenings, simple chords and a voice that was not quite in tune, but was so full of love that it did not matter. He heard every note as clearly as if the guitar were right beside him. He remembered the ocean, standing at the edge of it for the first time as a child, his feet in the cold, wet sand, his eyes wide at the impossible vastness of it, the way the waves came in and went out as if the whole planet were breathing. He remembered coffee, the smell of it in the morning in a small kitchen on a cold day, the warmth of the cup between his hands, the taste of it bitter and perfect and alive. He remembered faces, his mother's smile, his father's eyes, the face of every person he had ever loved, every friend who had ever made him laugh, every stranger who had ever shown him kindness in a universe that often forgot to be kind. He remembered snow, and autumn leaves, and the sound of wind through trees, and the taste of bread fresh from the oven, and the feeling of a dog's fur under his hand, and the way stars looked from Earth on a clear night, not the stars as navigation, but as a reminder of something larger than himself, points or resources to be claimed, but the stars as wonder, as mystery, as the beautiful unknown that had called to his species since the first human had looked up and asked, "What is out there?" He carried all of it, every sensation, every memory, every moment of joy and grief and love and loss. He carried it all inside him like a universe folded into a single mind, and it was enough, more than enough, to hold his identity together against the nothing. The monitors outside the chamber told a story that the Veltari could not comprehend. 1 minute passed, normal brain activity, stable vital signs. 5 minutes, still stable, neural patterns showing organized activity rather than the expected deterioration. 10 minutes. He had nearly doubled the all-time record, and his brain was not just surviving, it was active, engaged, as though he were experiencing something rich and vivid inside the emptiness. 30 minutes. Selvania had stopped watching the clock and started watching the neural readout with an expression that looked like someone witnessing a religious event they did not believe in. 1 hour. The monitoring staff had run out of precedents, run out of comparisons, run out of any framework for understanding what they were seeing. 2 hours. Selvania stood alone in her command chamber, and she was shaking, not with anger or fear, but with the dawning realization that everything she knew about the hierarchy of life in the galaxy was wrong. 3 hours. The prisoners in the staging area had gone silent, not with dread, but with awe, watching the time counter climb higher and higher into territory that no living being had ever reached. 3 hours and 41 minutes. Ethan opened his eyes inside the void, and even though there was nothing to see, the act of opening them was a declaration, a statement of presence, a refusal to be erased. And then he spoke, his voice the only sound in the perfect silence, carried by the chamber's internal sensors to every screen and speaker in the station. I am done. Open the door. Not a plea, not a request. A command, calm and clear and absolutely certain, spoken by a man who had spent 3 hours and 41 minutes in the deepest nothing the galaxy could create, and had come out the other side, not diminished, but somehow more complete, more himself, more human than he had ever been. The door opened, and light flooded in, and Ethan floated out into the staging area, blinking against the brightness, his body stiff and sore, but his eyes clear and focused and alive. The staging area erupted. Every prisoner, hundreds of them, roared with a sound that shook the walls, a sound that was not just celebration, but release, the sound of beings who had been told they were weak and worthless and doomed, suddenly discovering that those words were lies, that survival was possible, that hope was not foolish. Essential. Rin reached Ethan first, grabbing his hand with all 6 of his own, tears streaming down his small gray face, unable to speak, but saying everything with the strength of his grip. Ethan squeezed back and said, "Time to go." The revolt that followed was not chaos, it was precision. Rin, the mechanic, the small and nervous and supposedly insignificant Korvathi, was the one who made it possible. He had spent his days on maintenance duty, studying every system in the station, mapping every circuit, learning every weakness, and now he moved through the service corridors with purpose and speed, disabling security grids, unlocking cell blocks, shutting down the automated defense systems one by one. The prisoners moved as a unified force, organized by species, by strength, by ability, overwhelming the remaining guards not with brutality, but with sheer numbers and the unstoppable momentum of beings who had decided they would rather die fighting than die in a chamber. And at the front of it all, limping and broken and held together by nothing but will and the remnants of Colossus engineering, was Ethan Mercer, walking toward the command deck. The command deck doors were not locked. They were open, as if waiting for him. Selvania stood at her console, alone, her guards gone, her warden dead, her station falling apart around her, and she was not afraid, not exactly, but she was something that she had never been before in her entire life, uncertain. Her hand rested on the self-destruct control. One touch, and the station would detonate, killing everyone aboard, prisoners and crew alike, erasing the evidence of what had happened here. Ethan walked in and stopped 10 paces from her. They looked at each other. The High Inquisitor of the Veltari Empire and the Tier 0 human who had survived everything her empire had built to destroy him, and the silence between them was more meaningful than any trial chamber could have manufactured. "You could end it," Ethan said, nodding toward her hand on the console. "You could kill us all right now, and pretend this never happened." "Yes," she said, and her voice was quiet. "But it did happen," he said, "and you know that even if you destroy this station and everyone in it, the truth will get out eventually. Not because of me, not because of any one person, but because the truth always does." She stared at him, and in her silver eyes he could see the war being fought. Pride against reality, belief against evidence, the comfortable lie against the terrifying truth. "You told me I would not survive," Ethan said, and his voice was not angry or triumphant, but simply honest. "You were wrong, but not because I am special, not because of Project Colossus, not because of anything that was done to me in a laboratory." He took a step closer, and she did not move. "You were wrong, because you do not understand what humans are. You look at us and see soft skin and thin bones and short lives, and you think that makes us weak. But you are measuring the wrong things. Every human on Earth could have done what I did. Maybe not exactly the way I did it. Maybe not in these specific trials. But the thing that kept me alive, the thing that no machine could break, was not my body. It was not my augmented cells or my engineered DNA. It was the fact that I carry my entire world inside me, and no amount of fire or pressure or poison or emptiness can take that away." There are 8 billion humans on that little blue planet, Sylvania. 8 billion minds that build universes inside themselves every time they dream, every time they remember, every time they love someone. And every single one of them carries the same stubborn, relentless, unreasonable refusal to die that I do. That is what you should be afraid of. Sylvania's hand trembled on the console, and the moments stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then, slowly, her fingers uncurled, and her hand dropped to her side. She did not surrender. Kind of being who surrendered. But she chose, in that moment, to step back from the edge, because she understood with perfect clarity that destroying one human would change nothing, that killing 100 humans would change nothing, that the thing she had witnessed in her trials could not be killed because it was not a weapon or a technology or a mutation. It was the fundamental nature of an entire species, and it could not be destroyed without destroying every last one of them. And there were 8 billion more where this one came from. Ethan turned away from her and walked out of the command deck, and the prisoners who had gathered in the corridor outside parted for him like water around a stone, and their eyes followed him with something that had no name in any of their languages, but that every one of them felt in the deepest part of their being. They took the station's transport ships, 3 of them, enough for every surviving prisoner, powered up, and the docking clamps released, and the ships pulled away from the cradle of silence. The dying star outside painted everything in shades of red and gold, and the station grew smaller and smaller behind them, until it was just a dark spot against the fire. Rin sat beside Ethan in the cockpit of the lead transport, watching the stars open up ahead of them, like a road without end. And after a long and comfortable silence, the small Korvathi turned to the human and asked, "Where are we going?" Ethan looked out at the stars, battered, broken, scarred, held together by nothing but the memory of sunlight and rain and music and the faces of everyone he had ever loved. And he smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and means something true. "Home," he said, and his voice was warm and steady and full of a quiet certainty that felt like the first light of morning after the longest night imaginable. "I think it is time the galaxy met the rest of." And the ship flew on, carrying 1 human and 1 small alien, and a hold full of survivors, out of the fire and into the black, toward a little blue world that the galaxy had overlooked and underestimated and dismissed. A world that was about to remind the universe what it means to be human.